We start getting really scandalous this week with the body count of Edward VIII. 'Tis the season for some treason. Hello and welcome to Body Count, the podcast where we believe history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I'm Jessica Manor, and a toast to my co-host today.
Hello, cheers. It's Bethany Skelton at your service, my dear.
I am so excited for this. Bethany, how about yourself?
Oh my gosh, you left me like on a cliff, like hanging off for dear life. Like it was so bad to the point where I decided to start rewatching The Crown from like the beginning. Because it had been a really long time and I haven't watched season 2 and I know you have, so don't spoil it for me. But I was like, I have to go back. And there was Edward. And he just, you're right. You're totally right. The person that plays Wallace Simpson looks exactly like her. Like they did like a little flash of her reading a letter from Edward, how he was going to really try to get a title for her or whatever. And she looked just like the picture you sent me.
They did an excellent job, did they not? Like I was very, very impressed by it.
And his own mother was like, but she doesn't really say I hate you, but she was like, your brother died because of you. I was like, oh my God. The show is amazing.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to get to exactly why Mr. Edward was so deplorable.
Oh, she hates him. Like, who is he going to sit by at the funeral? Like, that's what they were like hashing out. Like, no, don't you dare put him next to me. I'm just like, geez, man. Like because he loved a woman. Okay, sure.
Sure, because he loved a woman. But I think we're all going to collectively find out why that's BS. Are you ready to start this,
yes.
Bethany?
I'm so excited.
Oh, yes. Yeah. All right, guys, I am officially done with all disclaimers. You know what you're getting into nowadays. So it's up to you if you decide to continue with this. We're kicked back on the couch right now and about to break down some seriously disturbing history. If we get all of this out of our brains, it alleviates our anxiety just the tiniest little bit. And in a world where there is a stressor around every corner, every little bit helps. Do you not agree?
Oh gosh, yes, please. I need all the help I can get.
I think you and I both do. There aren't enough therapists and medication in the world, but
hey, we find ways.
We do. That is why this is a judgment-free zone, except of course till we get to the things we're going to talk about later.
Then we're going to be a little judgy. Sorry.
We're going to get real judgy, but for good reason. Now, this is definitely not your boring history class, and we are not hardcore history. We're here to have some laughs as we talk about this pretty serious subject and not take ourselves too seriously. In this 24-hour news cycle, we just don't have time to process events anymore before they rip the next Band-Aid off and hit us with the next body count. We're here to slow it down, examine the events that shape the world we live in, and hopefully correlate them with current events that you have, all of 10 seconds to process these days. So if you're looking for that Hoover-esque, just the facts, ma'am, history, and on occasion true crime broadcast, glad you stopped by. We're not going to be for you. But if you want to be entertained versus preached at, we have a lot to get to today. But first, housekeeping time. Oh, now, if you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, guys. It's not for our ego, but I mean, we certainly appreciate those 5 stars. If you hate it, please just don't say anything at all. And again, it's not for our egos, but it does help us out so much on moving up the charts and on the business end of things. Also, please go find us Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Now, to our sources today. There are a lot. You guys have no idea how close I have come to losing my mind this week. Bethany does. Bethany's fully aware.
Jessica, I'm busy. Don't talk to me.
I'm busy. I'm writing.
I'm doing research. Leave me alone. Okay.
I am slowly
just making sure you're alive.
My mind.
Okay.
My German is not this great.
So how many, what do we got here?
Well, let's break it down. So I have combed information from the Nazi archives at Bonn, declassified American documents. I swear I've watched at least 5 documentaries made at various periods throughout history, plus our previous source, 17 Carnations, the Royals, the Nazis, and the biggest cover-up in history by Andrew Morton. And we are adding pretty much all the books and interviews that Professor Jonathan Petropoulos has ever done. And you can find it all on Amazon, including Petropoulos' work and Morton's book. Now, we have a ton of material to get through today, so let's just go ahead and jump right in. Okay,
cool.
We have the main, the measure of both of our main characters here in part 1 and part 2. But it's important to remember one thing as we finish our story today. Until pretty recently in history, everyone believed that Edward VIII gave up the throne for his love of Wallis Simpson. But I think today, we're going to prove pretty conclusively that this was in fact not the case. Edward was forced off of that throne, and Wallis Simpson was merely the pretext to get his bony ass off of it. But we have to get these 2 crazy kids together. So let's breeze through this so we can talk a little treason. Are you ready, Bethany?
Ooh, 'tis the season for some treason.
La 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 la. All right. So it's the fall of 1935. And Ernest Simpson accidentally throws into motion the crazy train on the way to abdication or giving up the throne. If Wallis is getting her proverbial rocks off with Edward, where's Ernest getting his at? Of course, he's not just loving his hand, right?
Well, no. I mean, what's that saying? Like, ladies, if he's not getting it from you, he's going to get it from somewhere else.
That is exactly right. So looking down the barrel of the silver jubilee that we were talking about last time, Ernest heads off on another one of these trips to New York on, quote, business. And he was getting up to some business. Now, remember that Christmas party where Wallis, whose divorce from husband number 1 was finalized in 1927, met her new husband, Ernest Simpson, in 1926? Do we remember that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was back in part 1, right? No, I think it was the end of part 1. Like, you're like, where he goes to this Christmas party and he meets a Wallis Simpson.
I think you're exactly correct. So, that party was hosted by a woman by the name of Mary Rafferty, whose own marriage was disintegrating. Geez, what is with these people? Get a bigger social circle, for crying out loud.
They're just in their own circle. They're in their club of like, yeah, we're all married, but not really. So let's just all have sex with each other.
It's like a swinger's dream, I'm telling you.
Maybe that's the earliest known swingers.
they just... I'm gonna let that one alone because I have so many jokes, and again, we got a lot to get to. So, least to say, she and Ernest were hitting it hard, if you will, and real hard. So, good old dependable cuckold Ernest had finally grown tired of not publicly being with his own new woman, Mary. So he needs to divorce Wallis if he wants Mary. I mean, that stands to reason, right?
Right. I mean, even though it's like really looked down upon, people still clearly, they still got divorced. So it's like, he's like, look, everybody knows you're with Edward, okay? But I would like everybody to know that I'm with Mary. So let's go our separate ways and everybody wins, right?
Exactly. Plus, Ernest is still in a little bit of a financial pickle, having to support his first wife and their teenage daughter. Not only that, but he's having to shell out for Wallace to keep up with the royals, as well as ensuring the unimaginable amount of very expensive shit, namely jewels, Edward was showering on Wallace.
She had herself that sugar daddy. So.
That's exactly right. He couldn't finance a new wife, his first wife, and have to finance Wallace in a divorce settlement as well. This guy, I mean, he needs to think it through. So Ernest gets an idea. If Edward wants Wallace, then he can pay for her expensive ass. And again, I don't blame the guy. Like, why wouldn't you? So Ernest hatches a plan to present to Edward. He will give up Wallace if Edward agrees to support her financially. So the death of King George, stalls this plan slightly. But in the February of 1936, Edward became king that January. Wallace takes a trip by herself to France with some friends. Now, this gives Ernest and Edward a chance to, chat alone. Mano a mano. So Ernest brought along his friend for support or as a witness. And I will say he's a pretty, it's a trustworthy witness. We'll say that to this meeting. And it's the friend's account that gives us the idea of what happened. And there, these two men basically hash this out without consulting Wallace, because Edward agrees 100%. Yeah. So Wallace finds out about it, and boy, is she pissed.
Dude, I would be pissed too. Like, excuse me, but where's my say in this?
I am not a rug at a carpet sale, right?
I am not some furniture you just rented. Oh, you wanna take over my payments for this rented furniture? I don't freaking think so. I am not a lazy boy chair. Like, no.
I'm not the Aaron's version of people. Like, dear God. So the thing about Wallace was she had wanted to go on the way that things had been going on, essentially. She wanted the freedom to see Edward. She never intended to divorce Ernest, and she certainly never intended to marry Edward. That's an absolutely insane idea to everybody except Edward. But, king's a king, so I suppose they're generally accustomed to getting their own way. It kind of goes with the territory. King.
I want it.
But I want it. I want it. I mean, it's crazy to think that Edward could marry a woman with two former husbands still living, because being the monarch of England comes with another duty. It means you're the head of the Church of England.
The church, yeah, God.
Yeah. You are expected to lead by moral example, as well as be head of state. And the Church of England at the time did not advocate divorce outside of extreme circumstance. However, Edward, because we know Edward, was hell-bent on the fact that he was gonna marry Wallace Simpson. He wasn't gonna be king if she wasn't gonna be his queen.
God.
So Wallace is feeling more and more trapped every day. So to give her a taste of just how sweet it is to be the king's consort, he takes Wallace on a little royal cruise. Now, up until this point, most of the British public was in the dark about the king's affair. Now, America and the rest of Europe were reporting it like crazy, but in Britain, of course we were. But
I know.
And it wasn't fake news. But in Britain, the media had this unspoken agreement, if you will, that they just didn't report on the private life of royals at the time. But eventually, the news broke, probably on purpose, as we'll later discover, in Britain. And the stolid, dependable British public were scandalized by the king's affair with the American divorcee. The backlash resulted in Wallis fleeing to France, where she tried to break it off with Edward, who in true Edward fashion completely loses his shit. She was only gone like 7 days, but in those 7 days, he threatened daily to kill himself, including cutting his throat with a razor, and he was literally sleeping with a loaded revolver to pump himself up to do it if she didn't return. Again, I can't help but give some credence to Father Odo's claims from the earlier episodes that Wallis was the only person who could give the king his royal jollies, if you will. And so I guess if you're Edward, that's a pretty rough future he's looking at if Wallis doesn't come back.
Oh, God.
I mean, if you don't ever get off again, I guess you might as well end it right then and there.
That's it for you. What? It's not worth it,
right? It's just, well, I'm done. Nothing precludes that. But as a quick aside, ladies and gentlemen, let us say this one thing. Never let anyone threatening that stuff keep you in a relationship that isn't healthy. I mean, we aren't mental health or relationship experts, so we're not going to say any more than that. But no, that's insane. That's crazy.
Yeah, no, because you should never be that dependent. No relationship should make you that unhealthy and that dark and that depressed.
No,
it's something that's definitely a sign of leaving the relationship or letting that relationship go. And if I was Wallis personally, I'd be like, look, I think you need some help, and I am not that person to help you.
He's not just any person. So if you are Wallis and your choices are ruining the king or being blamed for him offing himself, I mean, Wallis chose the lesser of two evils. And got her tight little ass back to Britain. You know, what are you going to do? So by October 27th, Wallis is officially divorced, kicking and screaming, knowing Edward is always going to follow her and always going to find her. She couldn't make Edward see, nor could anyone make him see, that all the popularity in the world wouldn't force Wallis down anyone's throat. So the fateful day finally came, and given the choice between being king and a life without Wallis, Edward chose Wallis. On December 10th, 1936, Edward VIII of the United Kingdom abdicated, and the king was no more. So we are caught up. Now, this is the story we've all been spoon-fed over and over again. The king that gave up being king for love. That Edward was always intent on abdication. But I contend that Edward was intent on abdicating being a constitutional monarch. Edward never wished to give up being a proper king. The dictator, absolute monarch, now that is what he was aiming for. Now, this is body count. We aren't here to tell you love stories. We're here to measure the death tolls and how the past can intrude on the present. So, let's take a look at the real substance and a look at the reality of Edward VIII. You ready to get into this, Beth Ann?
Yes, girl, let's go.
Let's do it. Now, we have to back up just a little bit in our story to when Edward was still king. Before he died, George V had stated to Prime Minister Baldwin, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. And boy, did that end up being 100% true. And from day one, Edward was all about tearing up the rule book and throwing it out the window. So, here we go. Edward had almost immediately began gathering a new sort of courtier by his side. For example, his cousin, Charles, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, who was a high-ranking Nazi officer. This ass even went so far as to attend the funeral of King George wearing his friggin' Nazi uniform and parading through the streets of London in the damn thing. Can you even imagine that, Bethany? You imagine when the Queen dies, just somebody, well, Harry might. You never know.
We've all seen his uniform, okay?
Right, and it was just too well made to be a costume. I'm sure they've got him in mothballs there at Buckingham Palace. Dear God.
Deep underground with a special key.
Exactly right. So even before old King George kicked the bucket, Charles had made it clear he was Hitler's emissary and was keen to do everything possible to open up direct and private lines of communication between Edward and Hitler. He gave a lad off his thoughts on Edward in a secret message stating Edward had told him in confidence he was determined to take the business of governing entirely upon himself and that Edward wished to speak in person to Hitler. Yeah. Edward was already going behind the government's back before his father's corpse was even cold, and the government was more than aware of this and the danger that Edward was already presenting. I mean, he was barely king, and already we see everything he was preaching when he was still Prince of Wales already coming true. Now, do you remember all that, Bethany?
Yes, of course. I mean, that was the whole thing. Like, especially in part 2, we saw that, they're like telling him, no, do this. And he would do the complete opposite, go joining Hitler's reign of men and parties and pro-Nazi this and everything. So but way before his father died and he became king. So it was very evident.
Like, oh, it seems dictators are very popular these days.
Yeah.
England may want one. So yeah, we already had those seeds there.
The Jews, that's Germany's problem. But they have a good idea about being a dictator, and we should do that in England. Excuse me.
Oh, it just gets so much worse from here. So in March 36, Hitler goose-stepped his way right on into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, effectively wiping his ass with what was left of the Treaty of Versailles, or, any other international treaty that was in place at the time. Now, Hitler was ready to start taking these gambles. Pressure at home was increasing, and he came to power by promising to rip up the Treaty of Versailles in the first place. Remember, now, it had really put Germany between a rock and a hard place, and it made things so bad that's why Hitler was even able to gain power in the first place. But even Hitler knew this was a gamble. Doing this risked war with the still unified and powerful European countries standing in his way. But he had an ace up his sleeve. Edward.
Yep.
Edward was following this event as closely as Hitler or anyone in Europe. And now we get to the first real charge against Edward. According to a report given to Berlin by Fritz Hesse, press attaché at the German embassy, he overheard a conversation between Edward and German ambassador Leopold von Hirsch, in which Edward allegedly said, "I sent for the prime minister," which at this time was Baldwin, "and gave him a piece of my mind. I told the old so-and-so I would abdicate if he made war." At this point, no one knew about Wallace, and Edward was still very popular with the people, if we'll all remember. Then he continues, "There was a frightful scene, but you needn't worry. There won't be a war." According to Hesse, Ambassador von Hirsch did a little jig and said, I quote, "I have done it. I have outwitted them all. There won't be a war." Can you believe that?
Oh my God.
I mean, he's having a direct conversation with an ambassador going around his own government, which first and foremost is unconstitutional.
It's a traitor.
It's going to get so much worse. Now, I say this allegedly as our accounts of the event are only accessible in German documents because, I mean, God forbid we make those disgusting Windsor trolls choke up all the information and tell us the damn truth for once. Now, supposedly, the king's support was immediately passed on to Hitler, who had been scared shitless there would be an immediate armed and dangerous response from Britain, which at this point would have had, a great many allies still kicking around Europe to come together and enforce the Treaty of Versailles with them. Hitler's occupation of the Rhineland and Britain's response, which was that of appeasement, gave old Adolf all the confidence he needed. And that was in large part due to Edward's support. Now, I believe that this is 100% true. And this is why we kind of call this a theoretical body count. That means that Hitler's policy of aggression began right here with the invasion of the Rhineland, and that Britain's policy of appeasement and the atrocities that followed were in some part due to Edward's pro-German attitudes. Now, granted, there are any number of factors that contributed to appeasement and German aggression, but I still contend Hitler's confidence resulted in large part from Edward's support. I mean, essentially, Edward let a foreign government, Germany, bitch fighting with his own government, Britain, know that he, Edward, opposed his own government policy. And then if it came down to brass tacks, he was intending to essentially overrule them, which at very least is unconstitutional. At worst, it's the actions of an absolute monarch. To me, whatever happened in the Rhineland and from there on out was at least a quarter on Edward. I don't know. What do you think, Bethany?
Oh, absolutely. Like you just basically said, like, hey, Hitler, if you really want to win, come take my country. Come attack my country. And I know I can tell you how to do it. I can tell you how to break through.
That we're just not going to stop you. There won't be a war.
Yeah.
Let Hitler have whatever he wants. It's outstanding. But wait, it is going to get much, much worse, folks. Don't think I would do a theoretical body count if it didn't get a lot uglier than this. Now, Edward, adolescent idiot that he was certainly not shy about stomping around and screaming, "I'm king." And it was starting to really, really piss his own government off. But again, he just wanted to stamp around and be important. He was, as per usual, not actually going to do any work. And that was becoming incredibly apparent in the way he was handling the red boxes. Now, we were just talking about the crown. Do you remember the red boxes, Bethany?
Yeah, that's a thing that sits on the desk, and in the beginning, it's obviously says the king, and then she takes over because she's now the queen. The very last thing she had was with her dad before he died was like, when no one's looking, I reach in and I turn the documents upside down. Because those are the ones that they don't want me to see right away.
Exactly. Well, Edward wasn't concerned with anything in them. So if you haven't seen The Crown on Netflix, the red boxes are essentially boxes that are full of state papers and are sent each day to wherever the monarch is in residence for their approval or signatures on these documents. Now, these documents include some of the most secret and vital government information, like above top secret. Boxes, though, were just left out in the open at Fort Belvedere, the prince's private residence. Boxes were returned late, and some of the most vital documents were even returned with rings from cocktail glasses on them.
Yes, my kind of party.
Absolutely. Unless those papers are, government secrets. In fact, the only person who seemed super committed to the contents of these boxes was Wallace. And when you consider how much time she spent in the company of von Ribbentrop, that is disturbing. Yeah, scary. A cabinet member, Sir Walter Runciman, was able to confirm these suspicions of information leaks to the then Prime Minister Baldwin. Runciman had been in an AM cabinet meeting, and at a PM reception, he found himself in the company of von Ribbentrop. Now get this shit. Von Ribbentrop then began discussing with Runciman what had been discussed that morning at the cabinet meeting, like just that freaking morning at the cabinet meeting. Now, After
he wasn't in the meeting, right? Like von Ribbentrop was't there.
No,
but he knew what was happening.
Yeah, he's the emissary of Germany.
Holy shit.
Yeah, now we're seeing it. So immediately following a cabinet meeting, the prime minister then goes around and debriefs the king, right? So that means that almost as soon as the king was debriefed, either Edward or Wallace or both had immediately shared that information with the German embassy, which is tantamount in my mind to leaking state secrets. Everything von Ribbentrop knows, Hitler knows. By leaking that information, Hitler had complete knowledge of the innermost workings of the British government. And as we all know, Hitler was a man with a plan and could now form those plans accordingly, including any information that resulted in every single death. History would eventually lay at Hitler's door. Again, Bethany, can you believe this shit?
No, this is ridiculous. It literally is like, hey, I have a secret. Don't tell anybody. Okay, I won't. Tell me. Hey, Susie, guess what Frank just told me? Literally, it's like the moment he finds out anything, he literally is telling all the secrets and all the information to
we realize this sounds like this is made up. This is not made up. This is what happened. So everyone in the British government is now aware of both Edward and Wallace's fascism love and found them both wanting. A pro-German fascist monarch is simply unacceptable. I mean, dear God, World War I wasn't even that long ago. Not everyone is just so quick as those two were to throw that right out the window. So in the summer of 1936, Edward leaking secrets to Berlin wasn't a leap. So the Foreign Office literally withheld some of the boxes. And those that were sent did not contain the most secret information. I mean, Edward and Wallace were a security risk, pure and simple. So it's at this point in our earlier story that Edward was ready to show Wallace the good life, and that August cruise we talked about comes around. Against the advice of the government, naturally. Our classic, quote, love story neglects to mention that part, but still, Edward's absence from the country provided an opportunity to scheme for those that knew Edward was a huge frickin' liability. Edward was, as we established in part 1, an adolescent idiot who never thought more than a second ahead and didn't give two shits about his duty. So, 1948, this is after the war's conclusion, a professor, M.R.D. Foote, was working on a history of the Times newspaper, and he finds a pretty cray discovery, y'all. He comes across a file. And in that file, we find that Geoffrey Dawson, the then editor of the Times, Canon Donn of Westminster, which was basically the mouthpiece, right-hand man for top dog Archbishop of Canterbury, and a very senior dude at the palace. And again, I'm sorry, guys, I was unable to pin down exactly who this was, and my brain, it's fried from this one. I may never be the same again.
You're forgiven.
Thank God. This is the one thing I couldn't pin down. Least to say, a very powerful group of political and religious bras were beginning we're beginning to work in concert to get Edward's bony ass off of that British throne. So they met while Edward was MIA porking Wallace in the Mediterranean, and our mysterious senior official and our religious man asked Dawson, who was very well connected, to begin kind of feeling out public and Dominion, think Canada, Australia, New Zealand, yada yada, opinion about Wallace as queen. And they began putting together reports. And guess what? Not one person would even consider having Wallace Simpson as queen. And this provides the perfect excuse for forcing Edward to abdicate, not for love, but because he was a liability. Soon, They had the entire British government on board and were meeting in secret to hatch plans to use Wallace as the pretext for eventual abdication. Okay, so are you following all this so far?
Oh, yes. Wallace is about to get thrown under the bus.
Oh, so hard, man. You know exactly where I'm going with this. So that takes us to October 1936, when Ernest and Wallace's divorce is finalized. And the press, in concert with the government, immediately began tanking Wallace's reputation.
Oh,
I mean, they
didn't see that one coming.
Not at all. They even start making shit up to further sink Wallace. The establishment was willing to go that far to stop Edward continuing as king. Now, Edward's downfall was not for love. It was because he was an adolescent fascist twat. Let's just call it what it is. Trying to marry a twice divorced, rather scandalous American was just like the topper on the cake. This is further supported by the 227 declassified documents from the State Department in Washington. I'm going to quote from it. The British government were anxious to get rid of the Duke of Windsor, which is Edward, guys. That's what he's going to be known as later. First and foremost, because of his fondness for Nazi ideology.
Fondness.
That is not what you want.
Nice word, Chase.
Not what you want on your tombstone, right? Like, not at all.
I mean, that's a very interesting word choice to describe Edward.
Brother, husband, and fondness for Nazi ideology.
I have a fondness for Nazis. Oh my God. What?
Now, the establishment wants him gone, and they found his brother would be a much more dutiful, suitable choice as king. Therefore, Prime Minister Baldwin informed Edward that Wallace was an unacceptable choice to his government and the opposition government, and the entirety of the British Empire. If Edward tried to marry her without government acquiescence, he would cause a constitutional crisis and the entire cabinet would just resign.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. So then, here it comes, sweet and simple. Baldwin then presented abdication as an option. And it was easy to force him off the throne because, as we will keep reminding everyone, Edward is an idiot. So, on December 12th, Edward stamped his foot, insisted he would never give up Wallace, who the establishment knew he'd follow to the ends of the earth, and abdicates after reigning for only 325 days. Boom! Ooh. George V was dead on, was he not?
Yes, he was. People mourned his death.
Right?
People loved him. He was a good king. He really was. King. People really did like him.
Because he stayed the hell out of it. That's why.
Yes.
He then claimed in his abdication speech that he, being Edward, was retiring from public life. All of Wallace's and most of Edward's friends deserting them, including Miss Emerald. Well, I shouldn't call her Miss. Lady Emerald Cunard. That is to say, all of their friends except the fascists and Nazi ones. So, little wonder they didn't need much converting in the future. The entire royal family blamed Wallace, of course. It's the woman's fault, not the moronic son the Queen Mother raised, or the brother no one bothered to check. Of course not, Bethany.
Of course not.
It couldn't possibly be the man's fault. It never is.
The women, if they can't have a baby, it's the women's fault. Not if the man, clearly the man would never shoot blanks.
Oh, no. That, never that. Never, his own fault for losing a throne. It's just never a man, Never. Still, It's better than what the Nazis' reaction was, who blamed the abdication on, quote, Jews and Freemasons.
They blame the Jews for everything. God.
But the Freemason, God.
Well, yeah,
that's a whole different bag of Nazi dicks that we will get into at another time as to why that was a problem. But still, Edward, adolescent idiot to the end, never gave any thought to what his future role might be. He didn't consider Wallace's title or honors, if he would even be allowed to stay in Britain, or he and Wallace's finances. And he soon found he missed those privileges of being king, Bethany. He was trumped pretty much at every turn by the new king, his brother, George VI, and the new Queen Elizabeth. So here they are, deserted by their friends and family, and the newly minted Duke of Windsor, as Edward is now to be known, and Wallace were left out in the cold. And that is when Charles Badeau shows up on the scene. But before we get to Badeau, let's backtrack for a second. Edward and Wallace eventually settle in France. Essentially, they are given an allowance by the royal family to basically stay the hell away from them, to just live in exile. So they are finally married at the Chateau de Condé in France in 1937. King George VI barred anyone from the royal family attending, but what hurt Edward the most was that while he had been granted the title His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, Wallace was denied the HRH and was to be called only Duchess of Windsor.
I don't think that's bad, right? Duchess?
It takes quite the pair to be pissed off because you're only the Duchess of Windsor.
You're a Duke and Duchess, right? Like, why is that like bad? Like, is that
well?
Like,
she was denied. She was denied the Her Royal Highness.
Well, she was never actually made queen. She was just sleeping with a king.
Well, it doesn't matter as long as you fell out of a queen's vagina. You're technically a royal highness, and when you marry that person, you are a royal highness. But they denied it specifically for Wallace. But to be fair, no king had ever abdicated in all of the many, many, many kings and queens that they had in Britain. I mean, there was no rule book for this. And to be fair, it's Wallace. You're not going to feel too bad for her as we go along in our story here, folks. No one at the palace bothered to tell Edward this directly. The task was given to his now sole equerry, Sir Dudley Forwood, to inform poor Edward of this fact. And I say poor Edward now because I want us to get a little bit of sympathy before I really rip that rug out from under you later on. The information was imparted immediately following their wedding, which, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like,
oh, damn.
Super bitchy by King George, right? Like,
it's brilliant. I love
it. It is kind of brilliant. It is like straight out of that Mean Girls book. So, in Forward's words, when His Royal Highness was changing to go away, like, aka their honeymoon, immediately following the wedding, the opportunity arose when I had to inform him. And I suppose it was one of the most difficult and unhappy moments in my life because it literally broke his heart. She was to him, was perfectly perfect. And anything that was denied her was not only an insult to her, but an insult to him. And he was shattered by it, end quote. Edward never forgave his brother. And from that point on, Edward felt he was free to do and say whatever he wished. Now, if we weren't worried before, Bethany, apparently up until this point, he's been holding back.
Like, what? I thought that's what he was already doing and saying whatever he wished.
No. Yeah, that's what I thought till we get to this point in the story. Right? Now he's apparently off the leash, and we're about to find out just how dangerous that can be.
Off the leash and very, very pissed.
And very, very pissed. I mean, he is just man-straighting real hard right now. So, back to our Nazi friend Charles Badeau. The Chateau de Condé, where the couple stayed and was married, belonged to him. And boy, did he have some plans for these two. Badeau was an eccentric millionaire who was half French and half American, and his considerable businesses in Germany were now subject to Nazi control. But small matter, he went all in supporting the Third Reich, becoming an economic advisor for Hitler and the Vichy French government, and he was eventually arrested for treason by the United States later on. Right. He reported back to Hitler everything Edward and Wallace did or said. Nazi Germany was far from seeing Edward as useless. In fact, they saw him as still being an incredibly useful ally. Now,
oh yes.
Badeau recruited Swedish millionaire and arms dealer, so like basically Prince Andrew right now, today, Axel Wenner-Gren, in plans involving Edward. Wenner-Gren was one of the richest men in the world at the time, and he was like BFFs with Hitler's top man, Hermann Goering. They, meaning Wenner-Gren and Edward, meet in 1937, and Wenner-Gren extended, on behalf of Hitler, an invitation to visit Germany as the Führer's special guest and his personal guests to Edward and Wallace.
Wow.
Yeah, so much for retiring from public life and politics. Now,
yeah.
The royal family and the British government of the day found this out through the grapevine, as Edward didn't bother to inform them about the visit. And
why should he?
Why should he? He's already off the leash now, apparently. Everyone's fucking horrified because, one, Edward appeared to be getting back into the mix and stealing his brother George VI's limelight, and two, he was interfering in foreign policy at about the worst time possible. But Edward just couldn't resist giving Wallace or himself the royal treatment. And that was something he knew they would receive from the Nazis. And boy, Bethany, did they. International crisis be damned. Hitler promoted this little vacay as a state visit intended to pave the way for peace between Germany and England. And here we are, yet again, Britain takes another hit in the propaganda war. Regardless if it was a state-sanctioned visit or not, it appeared as if victor and vanquished were on the most equal of footing possible. Edward's equerry, Sir Dudley Forwood, also attended him on this trip. His words, I think he went for two reasons. One was that he hadn't appreciated that he was no longer a national figure, a man of importance, a man whose views could sway people. And therefore, he hoped, because he never recovered from his hate of the war, the First World War, that he could persuade Hitler to stop his warlike attitude. And then secondly, he had this great worship of his wife, and I think he longed for her to be shown an enormous amount of flattery, end quote. Now, I personally think that first part of that about the peace and all that, that's complete bullshit. I think he wanted very much to be treated like a queen again, or a king again, and Wallace to be treated like a queen. Either way, it works. I stand by that slip of the tongue. So, I think he'd grown very tired personally of his exile and how his family was treating him. And in classic Edward adolescent style, he was going to, like, I'll show you. What do you think, Bethany? Agree or disagree?
Oh, absolutely agree. I mean, let's be honest. Like, you can't go from growing up and living the lifestyle of the rich and famous to literally having to now manage your money in an allowance you get from your family
Which that's cute because bear in mind this allowance is outrageous and he managed to save because he didn't have to spend any money while he was Prince of Wales.
Mm-hmm.
Like he had saved, but he was always very, very concerned about money. There was never enough money for him, even though he was fabulously wealthy. I mean, It's insane the money they got just a month. I think it was like something like 25,000 pounds monthly at that time, or maybe it was ridiculous. Maybe monthly, annually. I don't know. I don't know what that comes to in today's money, but more than you and I will ever freaking see. Let me put it that way.
Oh, yeah.
And that is where we are going to end part 3 of our series. Next week, we wrap this up where it gets very real and, if possible, even more offensive. Doesn't that sound exciting, Bethany?
Oh, gosh. Why do you do this to me? Every time, you just leave me hanging.
Now, we hate to do this, but these episodes are running long, so we have to skip our counterculture both this week and next week. We will resume plugging the work of more talented people when we wrap up as regularly scheduled after that. We promise you guys. What I can tell you guys, my brain is broken. I'm going to blame Edward and Wallace for that as well. Well, I think that gets it. If you would like to contact us, you can email us on our website, www.bodycountpod.net, where you can definitely listen, find links to purchase our source material. If you would really like to do a deep dive, we just skimmed the surface. So go check these guys out. You can DM me on Twitter and Instagram with any suggestions you guys have. You know, we want to know what you want to hear about. Like 100%. So follow the show at Body Count Pod on Instagram and Twitter and Body Count Pod on Facebook. Please tell your friends about us. If you like us, subscribe, rate, review the show. We drop every Wednesday anywhere you can listen to podcasts, including Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. Search Body Space Count. We pop right up. This week, we're going to be a little late. It happens from time to time as I had to wait. I had to wait on some last minute research. So it's actually, my fault. It didn't make it till...
God, Jessica.
I know. Oh, how terrible. Didn't make it to my inbox until down to the wire. And we do apologize for that. But next week, we're going to resume our normal Wednesday drops. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Jessica B. Manor. Where do people find you, Bethany?
Oh, well, you can find me on Facebook, Bethany Rose Skelton, Skelton, Bethany RN24 on Instagram. And now I am freshly on Twitter, Bethany Skelton 5. And both Bethany and Skelton is capitalized, the B and the S. So you can find me
Welcome to the Twitterverse.
Yes.
Bethany. We are
Twitter is fun.
Excited. Twitter is fun. It is a lot of fun. I always say the Romans had the Colosseum, Americans have Twitter, It's still an arena of mean, but I love it and we love it. So, okay, I think that does it for this week's episode of Body Count. Join us next week as we finally freaking conclude, Edward. Thank you. Thank you, God. But guys, this is where it gets really rough and really juicy. We promise. We love you guys. Bethany, anything else?
No.
All right. Well, we love you guys.
We love you. Yes.
So much. And we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye.